Sounds good. Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, and welcome everybody. Welcome to our living rooms. Thank you for letting us into your living rooms. If this was the before times, we would be gathered somewhere together in person and giving a round of applause. But we thank you for making some time to join us. So we're just going to give people a few more minutes to get here and for us to get settled. But yeah, please say hello in the chat and let us know your reactions to the film and let us know where you're tuning in from. Thank you. All right, we've got some local Houstonians and some New York City. Great. Some folks from other parts of Texas, Austin, Amarillo. Great, thank you. So we'll just give another minute.
Amarillo by evening. All right.
Great.
I like that. Tuning in from Houston, suburb of Deer Park.
Yeah, you don't hear that very often. That's funny.
Sass.
Love it.
Welcome, Jana. Or Jana.
All right.
Okay, Iris, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Great. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. Good evening. And again, a virtual round of applause for the film that you all just watched. That's such a powerful illustration and story of what we want to talk about tonight. We're excited to have you all here and to have a moment of connection and a moment to kind of process and talk. And we have a really great panel here who's going to engage in some conversation and some dialogue. And we also invite you all to submit questions and to interact with us. And my name is Iris Gonzalez, and I'm the Coalition Director for SEER, the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience. We're an environmental advocacy organization based here in Houston that came together shortly after Hurricane Harvey. So almost, we're celebrating our 3-year anniversary later this year. So it's my pleasure to serve as moderator tonight for this panel discussion. We just want to have some time and space to really dialogue and connect with you all. Maybe take half an hour or so to do that and to chat about this really powerful film that we just watched. So we again invite you to submit your questions in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to get to a couple of them. So let me introduce our panelists tonight, the folks that will help us kind of dialogue about this and some solutions and some calls to action for us here in our own backyard in Houston or in Texas. So our first panelist is Brian Barras, who of course is a protagonist featured in the film. And Brian currently works for the Sierra Club and leads community outreach and organizing efforts across Houston. The organization that he co-founded, Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, is a beneficiary of some of the funds raised from this event tonight. So we thank you again for your contributions. And next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert Bullard, who has many years of experience in this field and in this sector, and who we call the father of environmental justice. He is a distinguished professor at Texas Southern University, and a true champion here in Houston. So thank you, Dr. Bullard, for being with us this evening. And then finally, we have Marco Garcia, a student at the University of Houston and where he is a student organizer with the Sunrise Movement. So thank you, Marco, for being with us tonight. And I'm so excited that we have different perspectives here on the panel. And I have to say, oftentimes I find that I'm in a room full of women when we're talking about some of these issues. So I'm also grateful that we have these gentlemen here with us tonight. So thank you all so much for making some time to chat with us. So let's dive into some dialogue. You know, when I think about some of the themes of the film and how they pertain here to the work and the opportunities that we have in front of us in Houston, I'd like to hear the panelists' reactions and initial thoughts about some of the themes in the film. And I just want to lift up 3 of them and then hear kind of how they might apply in our local Houston context. So I think one theme is the theme of interconnectedness, right? Of how people and places and a common purpose are interconnected. And this idea that we're a global tribe of humanity experiencing these environmental issues together, and that connection is a source of strength for us. So the theme of interconnectedness. And then 2, I think the multiple generations that are involved, right? This is a multi-generational movement, and we're just in one moment of that movement. And there are generations of people impacted by some of what we saw in the film, the extraction of the planet, the extraction of the environment. And that work to heal also spans generations. So this idea of multiple generations. And then 3rd, I think the theme of power, right? That the justice that we're seeking is not going to be given to us. We have to demand it, we have to fight for it, and it will take all of us to change the systems and to make this common vision for justice a reality. So the theme of power. So let me turn now to y'all panel. How do you think that some of these themes or the themes in the film show up here in our local Houston context? And Brian, if we can start with you.
Ooh, well, you know, actually, I just wanted to say first, thank you, Iris and Dr. Bullard and Marco and CEC, Alicia, for hosting this film tonight. And just very happy to finally be able to show this in Houston, because, you know, we had planned to do a in-person screening, and of course, COVID-19 and the pandemic put a stop to that, and we haven't had an opportunity to. Oh, okay. Are y'all able to hear me? I'm being told my screen got stuck for a second. It's okay. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you. You're
yeah. So. Okay. So one additional thing too is just, you know, I want to honor Vanessa Guillen's family. I just came from a ceremony for her. It would have been her 21st birthday. Of course, she's a soldier who was murdered at Fort Hood and has been, you know, really moving the entire country to look at this issue. And I say that because I don't think it's unrelated, you know, completely to the work that we do. And as Dr. Bullard would tell you, you know, the environment is where we live, where we play, where we learn, where we worship, you know, all these things. And Vanessa Guillen went to Cesar Chavez High School. And this was the high school really that compelled us to start Tejas in the first place. And, you know, it made me really think hard because, you know, she graduated, you know, it would have been 20 years actually since we started, 1999. And it's just a reminder of how long these fights are, and you know, that they are very local and they do have impact on communities. And I know that she suffered from asthma growing up, and that she became a really prominent runner, you know, and I think it speaks a little to her personality of wanting to prove to herself and her family. And I think a lot of folks who grew up in these communities who face so many daunting realities before them, right, that they have to overcome, really make for strong, committed, determined people, and that's why you often see, these incredible organizers coming from these places. But I just wanted to say that, and of course, the community of Manchester and the surrounding area has been sort of a linchpin for helping us organize in the greater East End and throughout the Houston Ship Channel. And it's an area that I grew up in. I'm originally from the East End, and all the way from like Gulfgate area to Second Ward, Magnolia, um, all the barrios in between, and I still live here. So that's me, and we're still fighting for environmental justice in these neighborhoods and communities. In addition to all of the other social factors that come with that overwhelming oppression that you saw in the film, and that is also part of what happened to Vanessa, what happened to Floyd, what happened to another Chavez, right, who was gunned down in Denver Harbor. So all of these things are interconnected, just like we are interconnected, and I hope that that is something that came out in the film too. Thank you, Iris.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate you. Dr. Bullard, what would you add to that? How do some of the themes in the film connect to your work, or what's happening here in Houston?
Well, again, like Brian, I want to thank all who have helped put this great film together, and also thank thank all the folks who helped put this panel together. I watched the film and earlier this afternoon, and I think it's a great testament to truth telling, and I think it's important to, like Iris, you pull together those three themes, and I think they're very good, showing how this whole idea of intersectionality, how things are interconnected, and the way that we have defined the environment is everything. It's where we live, work, play, learn, worship, as well as the physical and natural world. And how, as humans, sometimes we forget that we are part of the environment, and in many cases, the most destructive part, and that the earth can survive without us, but not the reverse. And so looking at the struggle for justice has never been a sprint. It's always been a marathon plus. And it's almost like a marathon relay plus. You run your 26.2 miles, and then you pass the baton to the next generation to run the second, leg of that marathon relay. And I think the fact that that we are in this intergenerational mode, and that my generation of baby boomers, and I came out of the 60s, and we were fierce, unapologetic, not afraid to go to jail, and wanting to push the envelope. And we made great strides in pushing this country toward a more just and fair and equitable society. We did not reach the peak of perfection in terms of all people treated the same and equally, but we pushed the envelope. Now we have a generation of millennials and younger who are in the majority of this country in terms of population-wise, numerically. And so the power, the numerical power, has shifted from my generation to millennials and younger. And I see hope, and I see opportunity, and I see young people who are fearless, unapologetic, and not willing to wait 40 years, like many of us. Like, I've been working on this stuff for 40 years plus. And I've seen a lot of change, but I've seen a lot of things stay the same. Invisible Houston 33 years ago. A lot has changed in Houston, but damn it, a lot has not changed, and some has gotten worse. So when we talk about multi-generational, we also have to talk about power. And those who are in power will never give it up voluntarily. Now, I'm not a political science, I'm a sociologist, but I've lived on this earth long enough to know that you have to push and fight and push and fight. And I think that's a good sign, that the fact that young people today, that's hope with a capital HOPE. And that's optimism. And that gives us a great opportunity to work intergenerational. You know, I've known Brian's father for a long time. And we worked together a long time. And to see intergenerational, see other generations taking on these struggles and taking up the mantle and getting the job done. Now that's where I see Houston that's moving the envelope. There's a resistance, but we have to keep pushing, 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 because the numbers are on the side of that emerging majority. And right now, Houston has a majority of people of color. It has a majority of young people that can move that envelope. And so that's why I think it's very good. And I'll end there and let a young person talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bullard. And Marco, I'd love to hear from you, your reactions to the film, and how these themes connect to the work that you do, or what you do in Houston.
Yeah, so just first of all, yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak on this very distinguished panel. I think it's really bizarre for me just personally, because during my high school years and early college, when I was becoming like an environmental activist, I would look to organizations like Tejas and other surrounding Houston area organizations, and see them doing work right in this area, right. And in my early college years, I researched things that Dr. Bullard was doing, right, like in the kind of environmental justice work. So it's really bizarre being right here right now, but nonetheless, yeah, this is a great event. I'm happy to be here. So I think I would just my first just general reaction to the film, and speaking to specifically the ideas of multi-generationality and power. Yeah, so the first one, I think multi-generationality, I would always usually think of that in terms of thinking about the future and with the climate movement. And so as an environmentalist, as a researcher, I've always thought what we're doing now in this moment is very important for what's going to happen in the future, right? Not even just hundreds of years, so not even just decades, but hundreds of years from now, right? We're talking about multiple generations into the future that we're going to be affecting. But I think it's what the film does, which is very beautiful, and I think something that I haven't really thought about a lot, is looking backwards, right? Looking back to ancient civilizations, thousands of years ago, right? And looking at how humans have done things in the past. And so I think, yeah, that was very striking to me. I think seeing that, but also the power, the idea of power is interesting too, because that's also a kind of back to basics thing that I saw in this film, where it's literally using your speech, using art, using things that humans, what the human capacity and allows us to do, right? Like to make art, to sing and dance. So I think those two things are very beautiful to see in the film. How they relate to Houston, I think there are many ways that they relate, because when you look to Houston, it seems very hard in this kind of urban sprawl landscape to think that, we're thinking to past generations for guidance at all, or if we're even using, power to leverage climate action. But if you look at things like urban gardening, things like, farmers markets, which, to be honest, they're in secluded areas right now. They're not too, baked into access to other people, to most people. but I think you're starting to see that. You're starting to see people think about sustainability as a lifestyle. And yeah, I think you're starting to see that in the Houston area for sure. Outside of environmental activism, even in the food scene, you have sustainable, local, this kind of lifestyle popping up, which is really encouraging to see because it's starting to like become a part of Houston, right? So yeah, those are my comments.
Fantastic. Thank you all for that. And I think honing into this notion of power and accountability, and and on one side a sort of stack of resources and power, and on the other side the truth, right, of what's really happening and what's out there. In a place like Houston, where industry does have a lot of power across our systems, what do you think that and y'all mentioned examples of where it's already happening, right? We already have momentum, we already have movement, we already have wins, and we saw that in the film as well. But what do you think are some of the best practices to build that effective social movement in Houston? Or what are the things that that we want to strengthen? What is it going to take in Houston, the center of oil and gas, to really make that transition towards a just transition, towards climate justice, towards climate equity? What is it going to take on the ground? What are some of the best practices for building that movement in community? And Brian, we can start again with you.
Yeah, well, ooh, this comes up often, right? And I think when I participated in the toxic tours, especially with young folks, what I always wanted to emphasize was that there are other industries that you can aspire to enter, right? You don't have, and that there are things that are going to bring you more joy and fulfillment than money in this life, and that still remains true, right? But when you think of what an individual can do, I think the biggest thing is to really be open and to challenge yourself, to really think about the world that you live in and how you want to relate to it, how you want to operate in it. And that is the most important question, I think, that you have to start with. And if you look at these companies that are operating all over the world, many of them have home base here in the Houston area, and that was something that I had to think about a lot. It is why it has been so difficult to organize in a city like Houston, because the culture has made it so that we see only the good things from this industry and from extractive industries in general. And it's taken me, traveling to places like Louisiana, listening to elders like Dr. Bullard, my dad, but also the communities that they organized in, that they've been helping, for decades, and understanding that the negative consequences of these corporations and entities are things that I didn't really think about and that you don't hear about often in the city. And that's important for us to understand, right? We should be thinking about the other. And in a time like we are in right now with this pandemic, that is why we have been able or not been able to contain this virus, is because we have not worked together. We've made arguments about whether to wear a mask or not, political, and not really, driving our action by our compassion, empathy, and love for each other, but for selfish reasons, right? So those are the things I think that are really important, and then you can go into any career, any field that makes you happy, but those are the first questions I think you have to ask yourself. And every industry needs to be changed, right? Because they are also part of this system that is connected to and dependent on an extractive model. So you have some thinking to do, Marco, and I wish you all the luck. But it's an exciting journey, and that's part of life. That's part of growing up.
Thank you, Brian. And Dr. Bullard, from your perspective, your decades-long perspective, what do you think it's going to take in a place like Houston?
Well, that's a heavy question, but I do think there are some areas where I think we can lessons learned. For example, Hurricane Harvey, biblical flood, was the impetus behind the formation of SEER. And the idea of there should have been a SEER 25 years ago. But again, and sometimes it takes a catastrophe to be a wake-up call to get organizations that never work together to work together. And the idea of the fact that people who work on issues of wetlands, wildlands, prairie, who work on food security, who work on toxics, who work on children's health, affordable housing, transportation. We should have been working together a long time ago, because all these things connect. And if we look at this whole idea of Houston being a petropolis, and a lot of the corporations that we saw in the film that are operating in South America, I think it was Peru, and you start looking at in Ecuador, and you start looking at those places. These are the same companies that operate on the east side of Houston, on the ship channel. And many of the damages and problems that are being created by their operations, emissions and explosions, and when there's accidents, when there's hurricanes and floods and shutdowns and startup, I mean, the damage that's caused to the fence line communities are some of the same kinds of damages and problems caused in the film that we saw outside of the borders of the U.S. It's just a level of severity. We have more, well, I was going to say more stringent environmental laws, but I really may not even say that now, because a lot of them have been rolled back to the point of because of COVID and because of just streamlining and weakening, that things have now become almost at a point of desperation that we really need to hone in on solutions. And I think the fact that climate change, sea level rise, these severe weather events that are hitting us back to back to back to back, it's going to create more problems for our communities. And so that we have to get our organizations, and they don't have to be all environmental organizations. They could be children health groups. They could be the PTA, the school board, the links. It could be the NAACP and all the other groups, any of the groups that have members that breathe air and drink water and concerned about living and sustainability. That to me has to be a new plan to communicate out what the challenges are and what real solutions are, not fake solutions, false solutions, but real solutions are. And that takes resources, and it takes commitment. And right now, historically, communities of color and people of color organizations have not received adequate resources to build capacity so that we can, first principle environmental justice, speak for ourselves and do for ourselves. So there has to be a new formation of how resources is going to get sent to our organizations that are on the ground 24/7, that are working on these issues and know these issues better than anybody else. And forming these partnerships, community university partnerships, community-based participatory research projects, resource to action, community monitoring, because you can't trust the government I don't call any names, but I'll give you the initials, and we know the initials, TCEQ, to do what's needed to protect us. That's what we have to do. And that means that we have to kind of like build more and more expertise in our organizations and form those partnerships with our green groups and build our capacity with our grassroots organizations and make sure that we are on the same page, not working at cross purposes. Now that's a roadmap. If it were easy, we would have done it 20 years ago. It's like a walking a thin line and trying to get different people together on the same page in the same room. And with COVID, it's complicated everything. It's complicated everything. And with hurricane season and COVID, with rollbacks in environmental protection, that means that the urgency of now is right now.
That's right. Thank you, Dr. Bullard. Thank you for that. And Marco, from your perspective, what do you see that is gonna take to really build an effective social movement here in Houston?
Yeah, I think my own personal viewpoint is that politics itself, we often hear and think of politics as a kind of a battle arena and a place to go to war. I mean, we saw that with the debate, right? Like it's we don't see politics, and it doesn't help, is what I'm saying. Those types of events don't help to our notion of politics. And so I think politics itself needs to become like a means for justice, like a means for solving issues, and a form of empowerment, really, right? And that sounds kind of abstract, but when I was following Trump's election, which is, I think, one of the many places that saw a lot of young people become politically active. That was the case for myself. But one of the things that I heard, advocating and doing work during that time was that they wanted to get involved because they wanted to empower themselves and do something better, right? And this was young people my age, like around that time, which was around 2016, 17, right? And so I think we really do need to change that. And so changing the notion of politics, and so what does that look like? It means, going out and voting, doing what you can, I guess, with what you can. So if you can donate, you can donate. If you have a car, if you can go out and canvass, you go out onto the streets, you march with your friends, you talk to your neighbors about the issues, right? And so it seems kind of scary, right? I mean, at first it was for me, for sure. Like just simply canvassing your phone banking is just, it felt like an awful experience, right? Because you just don't have experience with that kind of stuff. It's something you're not really versed in once you get out of high school, I think. But yeah, I think that needs to change, just so people start seeing that as the solution, right? Because it is the solution. It's, I think, building a social movement rests on that, right? On that very like boots on the ground kind of work. So yeah, that's where, and so that's like one part of the question, right? I think the question was, how do we transition Houston to a more renewable, sustainable society? So I think that's like the activist speaking here, to that point. I think another point I would make is just, if you look at Houston's history and development and trajectory, if you look at the environmental history back in the early 1900s, the Houston Ship Channel, and the oil boom that made Houston what it is now, so to my surprise, wasn't the product of just oil discovery or the free market, I guess you could say, or just business doing what it does, as some people like to argue that it's just how it goes. Actually, the federal government was actually very hands-on early on in Houston's history. And so that to me is evidence that large-scale development projects are going, and planning are going to need federal and some sort of federal component to it, right? And so that's why I joined Sunrise, because it's all about promoting the Green New Deal, right? Which is a framework, a policy framework to marry climate action with social justice, right? So I think those are two points I would like to make. Just that we need to really start bringing in people who don't usually vote, who are not usually politically active into the conversation. I think one of the things that the film said was, democracy is the key to saving the planet, right? And I think that's very true. And I think that's why politics is so important, and changing that notion is so important. But the other thing I would say is, from a practical point of view, I think you're going to need a federal, there's no other way to do it. This climate change is such a massive issue that it's going to need, the largest, maybe even political systems that don't exist right now. So that's scary, but yeah, that's the kind of like level we're at here.
That's great. Thank you, Marco. Thank you for those calls to action and those reflections, and offering those solutions. That's great. I want to go next to a question from the audience, and so this is a good segue into that. It's really about something we saw over and over again in the film, around how pipelines were impacting multiple communities over such a large stretch of land, and again, many generations of people. So the question is, what do y'all think about the Texas bill HB 3557 that is making a felony for activists to protest against pipelines? How can we move around this? Is this the end of peaceful protests? And I'll open it up to any of y'all that want to answer.
Let me just say that there are forces that have been unleashed that are anti-democratic and using your First Amendment rights to assembly and to protest and freedom of speech. And it's selective in the way that at least 36 states have passed laws that restrict protest against pipelines. And a lot of that has to do with the extent to which corporations have been elevated almost to personhood and given rights that people fought and died for to get those rights. And so when we start codifying the imbalance between corporations and people, it will end up basically taking away our basic civil rights, human rights, and ultimately change our democracy. This is nothing more than heavy-handed kinds of legislation that is being pushed by oil and gas and companies that want to gag legitimate peaceful protest. Now it's wrong, and we need to fight against it every day, 24/7.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Oil and gas companies break the law all the time, and they just like ram their way through people's property illegally. And for folks that are always asking themselves, why are protesters getting arrested? I think that's indicative of the system failing us for so many years. Dr. Bullard, myself, my dad, so many other environmental organizers and activists have gone through, the rule book. We've gone to EPA, we've gone to TCEQ, we've gone to the city of Houston, Harris County, you name it. We've been there, we've had conversations, we've advocated, and it has not worked. And so folks have had to resort to peacefully protesting. And that is and has been effective throughout the history of this country. So what happens is then the state and the corporations working together have to criminalize these protests. And so you have, mothers and fathers and daughters and sons, getting arrested for peacefully protesting because the system has failed them and put their communities in harm's way. And that is why people protest. It's not something that is fun to do for its own sake. There is a purpose. There's a purpose and there's a goal. And oftentimes, that is the only way to fight power when you have very little. So I'll say that question, and that should scare everyone, because when laws are passed to criminalize protests, it does not just apply to, the folks who are fighting specific projects. Those laws then get interpreted with very broad strokes. And because of, the history of this country, we know that there will be disproportionate impacts on communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous communities, and the policing of these laws will impact those communities more too. So then you just have added another layer of oppression on these communities.
Let me just back up also and say these laws basically are throwback to the laws that were passed by these southern states to stop Black people from marching and demonstrating. And the example that comes to mind is John Lewis and Dr. King, when they were marching from Selma to Montgomery on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the fact that they were peacefully marching and protesting, and the laws that were in Alabama and enforced by the state troopers and all of that. We all know now, we see those black and white footage, that it was unjust, unfair, and we look at it as history lessons. But they're lessons to be learned by these new laws that's criminalizing peaceful protest. And we need to be really concerned about this, whether it's laws passed to criminalize protests against pipelines, or the peaceful protests by Black Lives Matters and other protesters who are protesting for racial justice and criminal justice reform. Now it's getting to the point where people are wanting to criminalize you exercising your basic right of protest. Now that is going, you see that's the people, my grandmother said, that's the camel's nose under the tent. You get that. That's like you're getting a little bit. Next thing you know, you've lost your rights. We need to be concerned about these laws.
Thank you. Yeah, and that perspective of history, right? That these systems, they don't really go away. They evolve. They get new names. They get new labels, but they're really the same persistence. Marco, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is honestly really just the blatant, partnership of, police brutality, militarism, and that kind of sector, right, with the fossil fuel industry. And you see it time and time and again. We saw it in the film. Who besides the protesters, at the pipelines, on these marches, who else was there? It was the police. It was the government's police forces, the secret, small military groups being deployed by governments, by corporations even. So yeah, it's a bit like the Twilight Zone, right? We're seeing fossil fuel corporations be protected at the expense of, future generations, people alive today. So yeah, this is just like a textbook example of profit and property over people. So there's, I mean, it's the reason I say it's a Twilight kind of thing, because it's, you know, we should be actually, you know, prosecuting these people, right? Like the fossil fuel people who lied basically for decades, right? Um, it should be the other way around. We shouldn't be protecting them, right? Um, yeah, and I would say to Dr. Bullard's point about MLK, it's funny. I'm not just saying this, but I was literally reading the letter from Birmingham just a couple of days ago, and he talks about that about how he was saying during that time that he wasn't telling people to break the law. He was telling people to break unjust laws and laws that needed to be, you know, changed, right? Um, and that even goes back to Lincoln, to be honest, that he said that as well. He says something like that as well. Um, you know, it's honestly, how do you change that? How do you change a law that basically bans political dissent? I mean, it's tough, right? It's so backwards that it shouldn't be right, you know, that we shouldn't stand for that.
It's un-American.
There you go. There you go. In an election year. Thank you, Dr. Bullard, for making that connection. And then our last question from the audience that we'll have time for tonight. There's a couple of people just curious about how they can join the efforts of the Women's Treaty, and how kind of more broadly they can connect to and give voice to and support Indigenous leaders and Indigenous communities that we saw in the film. So what are some of the ways that people can join those efforts and be in solidarity? Brian?
Yeah, I'll answer that one. And you know, I'll say first that the whole notion of indigeneity is a really important conversation, and I hope that that's something that you know, was emphasized and brought out in the film in a way that helped you better understand that reality, right? Because we're talking about communities and people who are from this land, have always been on this land for thousands and thousands of years, and who have been displaced from that land, and you know, and whose entire lifeways have been criminalized, and prevented from taking place. And even, you know, all of us who are from the Tejas area or the Southwest, you know, who may identify as Hispanic or Latino or Latinx, many of us carry indigenous ancestry. And that's been a journey, I think, that has been pivotal for me to understand why this work has been so important to me, why it has been so meaningful for me. And it was this work that drove me to those communities, because we are detribalized people, and my ancestors, you know, are from the Tejas region, but also Mexico, and also parts of the Southwest, and I have African ancestry too, you know, and many of us have mixed ancestry. So that's all super important, I think, and it's a whole other area where, you know, young folks are teaching us and reconnecting with their past. As Michael said, like, you know, it made him think about, wow, like ancient civilizations, like, they're still here. We are still here. You know, and even in the African American community, you know, a connection to a particular place in this. Many of us who live in colonized settler states, you know, that has been taken from us, and that is part of this work too, because for us to be able to know how to relate to the planet, how to live on this planet respectfully, I think, this is my opinion, that we have to reconnect with our indigenous ancestry, and to be really, really committed to, at least understanding that we are part of this planet, we are part of this land. And so there are many, many, many groups, and I think it's important for each of you to figure out, how you want to connect with indigenous communities, how to support indigenous people and their causes, right? So one of the big themes in the film was free, prior, and informed consent. And I was in Peru at a big government meeting that was called Consulta Previa, a consultation process where nation to nation, government of Peru was meeting with, the government of the Quichua, who live along the Tigre River, treated as independent nation, right? People who own this land or are, in control of it, sovereign people. So I think those are things that, have been wrongfully taken from many of us, and that is part of the story. So if you want to support indigenous people, one, learn who they are in wherever you live. Learn who the original peoples of the territory that you live in are, and support them, right? And do it in a respectful way, but also find out who your people are, and this goes for everyone. I think it's important for all of us to have pride in our ancestry and our ancestors, and to understand, how the place that we come from has made us who we are. Even if we've been separated from that for hundreds of years, it's still in us. It's in our blood, it's in our DNA, it's in our memory, it is always going to be there. So that's what I'll say. And the person leading the treaty, the Indigenous Women's Treaty, is Casey Camp. She is part of a group called Movement Rights, so you can look them up, and they continue to get signatures. It's for Indigenous women only, because that's what makes it special. It's the first time a treaty has been signed within and amongst Indigenous women. So yeah, look that organization up, and I'll put it in the chat. And I think that's all I have. Thank you, Iris.
Thank you, Brian. Fantastic. Well, I wanna end with hope, because this as y'all have lifted up, there's a lot of work for us to do, and there's a lot of work for us to do individually, in coalition, with unusual partners, and across many systems. And this work is not new, and it will continue after us. And sometimes I can feel very, to Marco's point, scary and daunting and overwhelming, right? But we have to have hope, and we have to have that seed of possibility. So I want to close with just a rapid round to hear from each of you all. One thing that gives you hope as you think about the future. What is one thing that gives you hope? And Marco, let's start with you.
So I know we talk about anyone versed like in climate change and environmental change knows of this other scary term. It's tipping points, right? It's the idea that there will become a point when something like the Amazon rainforest, if it keeps burning too much, it will inevitably turn into a savanna. It will reach a tipping point to where we can no longer stop it from where it's going. Those are scary things to think about, but I'd like to think about social tipping points. So things that reach such a pitch that that there is no really coming back after that, right? And I think we're starting to see that. I mean, I think we're starting to see that with COVID-19. We're starting to see that with climate change. I think we're reaping all of the fruit that we've basically we've planted for so long. We're reaping biodiversity loss. That's one of the main drivers of disease spread like COVID-19. And so I think the good thing that gives me hope is that, you know, I'm hoping that we're reaching a social tipping point, right? That we're going to reach a point to where it's unthinkable to go back to whatever normal was, right? And so I'm hoping that that's what gives me hope is the possibility of new realities, right? Of like opening the horizon again to what is possible, I think. So that's what gives me hope. That's what I tell myself every day anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco. Dr. Bullard, what gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is the enlightenment and the mobilization of young people, and the fact that having the kind of fierce, I guess, urgency and the ability to use technology, social media, to communicate in real time and organize and mobilize, and the ability for young people to work with um, their elders in building this intergenerational collective movement of a new majority. And I think that's powerful, and it gives me hope that we can make transformative change and not these little baby steps.
Fantastic. Thank you, sir. And Brian, you'll have the last word. What gives you hope?
So the film is called The Condor and the Eagle, and it's based on a prophecy called The Eagle and the Condor. And you know, I think thinking about that prophecy gives me hope, and it simply states that, you know, we're in a moment where there's a potential for a shift, like a paradigm shift in thinking and how we what our driving force is. You know, is it one that's intellectual, rigid, and methodical, or is it driven by the heart, compassion, love, and you know, just seeing everything that's happening in the world, I believe it. Yeah, I really do, and I see, you know, I do see a shift in people's understanding of what it means to be here on this planet, to be alive, right? And it's hard not to, with the storms and the fires and the explosions. Um, we've lived a really impressive, you know, in an impressive time with what technology has given us. But it has come at a cost. It has come at a huge cost, and we're seeing that. And so the hope that I see is also, you know, with that level of understanding in our young folks, but also in folks, you know, in their middle age. Acknowledge, you know, the elders who have seen this even before us and have been doing, you know, the really hard work to raise us, um, to be able to take advantage of this moment, right? Because it's taken decades just to understand what's happening. And I see that in all the movements, in Black Lives Matter, in the indigenous rights movement, you know, in the environmental justice movement. And, you know, we have a stronger and more committed group of young folks that that I feel hopeful for, you know, the time that I've spent doing this work. And I know that Dr. Bullard does, and my dad, and so many others, right? So yeah, keep learning, keep growing, and keep doing the right thing.
Thank you, Brian. What a great way to conclude this conversation and this reflection on this film, and a reminder that it's us, right? We're the ones we've been waiting for. It's no one's coming. It's me, it's you, it's us, and it is now. So thank you all so much. Please join me, audience, in giving some love to our panelists, Dr. Bullard, Brian, Marco. Thank you so much for your time and for spending this time with us here tonight. And I also want to thank, again, Citizens Environmental Coalition and all the organizers of tonight's event that made this possible. And thank you, audience, for joining us this evening. We hope that this inspires you to take action and to continue the work in solidarity with all of us. Thank you very much. Buenas noches. Good night.
Thank you, Iris.
Buenas noches.